Well, hello there, and welcome back to the show. And today I'm looking at a Facebook post that makes a bold claim about Antifa. And this was shared by somebody named Mr. K on his Facebook wall. And Mr. K is somebody who I used to know in my high school days who really just posts a bunch of stupid crap on his wall, and I debunk his posts on this podcast. So, what did that post say? It said Antifa isn't fighting fascism, they're just the masked street muscle of the Democrats when they don't get what they want. End quote. So, this kind of post is short, sharp, and designed to stick. But is it accurate? So let's break it down. Let's see how factual it is. So the first aspect is claims about so called Antifa's objectives. The post starts by saying Antifa isn't fighting fascism, and that's simply not true. Antifa, short for anti fascist, is, by definition, a movement against fascism, racism, and authoritarianism. Their actions focus on disrupting far right groups and individuals who promote those ideologies. You might not agree with their tactics, but to say they're not fighting fascism misses the point entirely. So, aspect number two of the shared post, the masked street muscle aspect of it. The post calls Antifa masked street muscle. That phrase is meant to reduce a political movement to nothing more than street brawlers. Yes, some Antifa members do show up masked, and sometimes confrontations happen, but here's the thing: federal law enforcement agents also show up masked these days. ICE and DHS officers routinely wear masks and tactical gear, so why is it only sinister when protesters wear them? And let's be real, nobody knows who's behind some of those ICE masks. There have been cases where law enforcement tolerated or even included officers with ties to white supremacist groups, and some of them might not really even be officers at all. They might just show up and kidnap people off the streets, and these instances are not being properly investigated. And by this point, you may have heard of Alligator Alcatraz, or as some critics call it, Alligator Auschwitz. And why are they calling that now? Even more, perhaps? Because apparently hundreds of people have disappeared from Alligator Auschwitz and nobody even knows where they are. So there are literally people being disappeared, and these are secret police, and they are intentionally acting as secret police. So that's why people are saying we need to fight these efforts, because there's no due process. There's no there's just no clear sign of who actually is an ICE agent and who isn't at this point. So the idea that masks make Antifa uniquely shady is a double standard, and frankly, we know who the shadiest ones are at this point. They're the ones who are just taking people off the streets and making it so that due process is now considered a far left talking point. Something that just like 20 something years ago was considered the norm, to actually have a legal process. Well, now they're saying that's just like, you might as well be a communist if you're believing that, these people that they're being, or that are being detained, or in some cases thrown into these gulag style prisons. They're trying to make it seem like if you object to that on any level, well, you must be a communist. And ironically, of course, it's authoritarian regimes, like communist regimes, that would want to put people into gulags and not have any proper due process rights or anything like that. So the it's not just a double standard. It's the double standard isn't the sole issue here. It's the issue that they are trying to erode rights. So, the idea that it's just suddenly acceptable that you don't have evidence and people can't know where these people are being disappeared to and stuff like that. And there's no like look at the case of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, for example. They keep on shifting the narrative on that one. They the the president of El Salvador, Bukele, I think his name is, he was saying that Kilmar Abrego Garcia is a terrorist. Really? What? Well, shouldn't you have to engage in a terrorist act if you are a terrorist? And in addition to that, I'm going to get more into who some of the real terrorists are a little bit further down the line in this episode. So, what about claim number three? The idea that they're uniquely violent, that Antifa is uniquely violent. Well, let's do a little reality check here. Let's tackle the core claim of violence. So critics say Antifa is dangerous and violent, but here are the numbers. According to the Anti Defamation League, and I have my own critiques of the ADL, but I think they're actually correct in this information, this data gathering that they did. Between 2010 and 2020, right wing extremists were responsible for more than 75% of extremist related murders in the US. And 2019 alone, every single extremist killing documented by the ADL was tied to right wing extremism, not Antifa, not left wing activists. Meanwhile, Antifa, their record of killings is near zero, and you should really keep that in mind here when it comes to the panic alarm button that they're trying to get everyone to respond to. If a group has practically zero killings, maybe just like one or two in their entire history, does that sound like the most dangerous group of all time? You could find people who were killed in fistfights in a local bar or something like that. You know what I mean? You don't necessarily declare a national emergency over an occasional fight, right? I mean, it can be a problem, don't get me wrong, and it can even deserve media coverage, but to treat it like it's the gravest national security threat is a little bit disingenuous. And researchers and journalists who track political violence have noted that Antifa related deaths are, again, almost non existent because the movement is more associated with vandalism, confrontations at protests, and, yes, property damage, not lethal violence. So keep that in mind. Compare that with attacks like Charlottesville in 2017, where a white supremacist drove his car into a crowd of counter protesters, killing Heather Heyer, or the 2018 Tree of Life synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh, where an avowed neo Nazi murdered 11 people, or the 2019 El Paso Walmart shooting, where a gunman targeted Latinos and he killed 23 people. These were deadly right-wing extremist acts, not Antifa. So it's a little bit odd to single out Antifa when with just these few instances you have more, just a higher death toll. That's a little bit more dramatic than somebody who may have like swung at somebody and hit them or something like that. And you know what? If somebody does, you know, injure somebody in a protest or something else, they can be charged and they can be held accountable individually for their actions, you know? And let's look at the Trump administration's narrative a little bit more here. Under the Trump administration, the public message was flipped out upside down regarding this topic. Trump repeatedly has painted Antifa as the greatest domestic terror threat while downplaying or ignoring violence from neo Nazis, the Proud Boys, and the KKK, of course. Internal DHS and FBI reports, they show the opposite of Trump's claims. Right wing extremists were the bigger danger and still are. But publicly, the administration fixated on Antifa in the first term, and they're still doing that now. It wasn't about facts. It's still not about facts. It's about narrative. Blaming Antifa fits neatly into a campaign message and a just great uh, lie about left wing chaos and lawlessness. A useful enemy, even if the numbers don't back it up. So, what about the other claim that Antifa is the Democrats' tool? So that leads us, back to the claim in the original post that is just it's a very small post, but it's actually brimming full of lies. So the claim that Antifa is simply a tool of the Democratic Party is laughable. It's a conspiracy theory that pops up again and again. In reality, Antifa is decentralized. Let me say that again. It's decentralized. There's no national organization, no leader, and no official alignment with any political party. Sure, some individuals may also support Democratic policies, but that doesn't make Antifa the Democrat street team or anything like that. In fact, I would assume that a huge chunk of Democrats would critique Antifa or things done under the name of Antifa because, frankly, they would actually be too afraid in a lot of cases of seeming like they're aligning with Antifa because quite often the Democrats actually cater to right wing talking points. We've seen that again and again and again. So, the other part is that they resort to violence for the Democrats when they don't get what they want. You know, it's claiming that Antifa lashes out when they don't get what they want. So this paints the group as petulant or violent by nature, but that ignores the broader history of protest and direct action. Movements across history, from labor rights to civil rights, have used disruption when they felt democratic systems failed to address their concerns. You can disagree with the tactics, but reducing it to they didn't get what they wanted oversimplifies the issue. And of course, the standby comparison would be January 6th. What happened then? Well, Republicans, they lashed out because they didn't get what they wanted. They didn't get their orange doofus in power in 2020. And, they tried to undo the results of the election. And, that's a little bit of a bigger threat nationally than, an occasional person throwing a punch or something, during a protest. And, on top of that, keep in mind that when the civil rights movement was going on, they were trying to claim that Martin Luther King Jr. was, you know, behind all of the riotous behavior that was happening at the time. And of course, you can find a lot of classic footage of cops like beating protesters, uh, spraying them with fire hoses, sicking dogs on them, and that sort of thing. So back then, of course, it wasn't just protesters who were, acting in a violent way. It was the system that was just as often acting in a violent way against, individuals who were just trying to make their voices heard and who opposed racist policies, segregation and other policies. So it's been a long time tactic to try to discredit a cause by trying to link it especially to some violence, even though of course there's been political violence throughout human history across the board. And frankly, most of the political violence comes from the systems themselves or the defenders of the systems themselves. So, what's the takeaway here? What's really happening? The Facebook post oversimplifies, uses loaded language, and pushes a partisan narrative. It's not about understanding Antifa, it's about discrediting them, and by extension, the Democrats, even though, like I suggested, the Democratic Party has very little to do with anything under the banner of Antifa, actually. You know, if anything, a person who would consider themselves anti fascist might want the Democrats to actually do more, to combat fascism. And that would be one of the main problems that an actual person who believes in Antifa, who is anti fascist, that's what they would want. And keep in mind, the scare tactics being used with Antifa, they've become sort of a boogeyman. Some of the conspiracy theories about January 6th were that everybody there was Antifa. You've heard that they were Antifa, they were the FBI, they were all there by George Soros's command or some shit like that. Just a bunch of ridiculous talking points. Nothing to do with what actually happened. And we know that actually Turning Point USA was actually busing some people into the January 6th uh, celebration, as it were. That's actually who was busing people into there. It wasn't George Soros or some national Antifa headquarters. It was the Turning Point uh, types of people who were bringing in protesters, if you want to call them that. And meanwhile, the far greater threat, violence from organized far right groups, often gets swept under the rug. And the irony is, the very people calling Antifa masked thugs cheer on police or ICE agents who are themselves masked and militarized. The mask isn't the problem, it's the story being told about who wears it. And that's the danger of this kind of rhetoric. It distracts us from the real risks by exaggerating the wrong ones. So, the thing is, like, I agree that ICE agents should not be wearing masks, and if anything, it should be them who is facing the most pressure to be unmasked during a protest or frankly any sort of event. If you are an officer of the law and you want to be seen as legitimate, well, people should know, they should be able to know what part of what agency you belong to, what part of the government you belong to, and all that sort of stuff. And really, right now, the main point that we need to make as a country is that we're not going to stand for government lawlessness. The ICE stuff, it needs to be, there needs to be some real accountability there. They can't just go around harassing anybody who is non-white and who might speak a different language or something like that. That is not freedom. That is not democracy. It is not national security. It is actually a cause for people to panic. And I suppose that's what they want. They want to create panic and fear because that is how, that's what fascism thrives on. They are bullies. They like to bully people. And their solution to any problem is to beat it, shoot it, throw it in a prison cell, maybe deport it, and sometimes just to kill it, you know? And that is the right wing approach to a given problem. And we're seeing that increasingly as time marches on. And If Donald Trump has done anything good, I would say that he has pretty thoroughly debunked right wing ideology. He's exposed it all as a sham, and by this point, I think, or I at least hope, that the people are getting wiser about this and realizing the folly of this sort of approach to politics. Anyway, that's it for today's episode. If you found my little breakdown of this bizarre post on Facebook useful, make sure to subscribe and share it with someone who's tired of scrolling past half truths online. Until next time, keep questioning, keep digging, and keep thinking critically.